what's happening with the current challenges around investing, economy, war, the emotional decisions that people are gonna be making around fear, and how can we make better decisions. And also we'll talk about the long-term path as well.
So my pathway is probably a little untraditional. I studied genetics, went to medical school, worked in big pharma, and very early on, I realized that there's a huge gap in terms of financial literacy, financial freedom, in terms of really understanding how money works, even if you're very, smart, even if you have all the degrees.
And I was surprised a lot of times people with PhDs, scientists working for NASA I was like, well, these people must be really super smart. And they are in one area. And then for some reason, they left their brain in that area and not used it in their personal life. A lot of times they would be shocked, just like, I'm like, you have a skill set in this area for organizing a whole like a multi-million-dollar organization, but they wouldn't bring the same skill set in the personal life.
I think fundamentally, when you run a business, you want to understand what's working well in the business and how to improve that. And you also want to understand what you want to test out. I think you mentioned as well that you like to tinker with things. You'd like to say, hey, things are going well. I have this stable job as an engineer. What happens if I quit? Let me experience that.
Thank you for joining us here for this video. We've noticed that there are a certain percentage or a high percentage of our audience haven't subscribed to our channel. If you can please click on the button to subscribe to the channel, it will help us create more content. Which will help us reach more amazing people like you, to support them, to serve them. So please click on the subscribe button, and I'll see you on the next video. Thank you. Bye. I'm excited to have Mustafa here on our podcast today. Mustafa's going to go talk about his story a little bit, his origins, how he got started in the business and investing world. I'm super excited to share his journey with you all. What we really want to jump into after Mustafa gets into his story is what's happening with the current challenges around investing, economy, war, the emotional decisions that people are going to be making around fear, and how can we make better decisions. And also we'll talk about the long-term path as well. How can you go towards creating a purposeful path through business and investing as you move forward? So let's jump in. Great to have you here, Mustafa.
Thank you, Faisal. Great to be here.
Yeah, so why don't you just jump into your story? Let us know. My favorite thing is origin stories. How did you get started in the business world, and what drove you to go towards this?
Yeah, sure. So my pathway is probably a little untraditional. I studied
Mhm.
genetics, went to medical school, worked in big pharma, and very early on, I realized that there's a huge gap in terms of financial literacy, financial freedom, in terms of really understanding how money works, even if you're very, smart, even if you have all the degrees. Sometimes there's a disconnect when it comes to like learning how your wealth grows. And I feel like that's because no one really teaches you. Early on, I had a friend of mine who was maybe, 6 years older than me. He's a dentist. He's very good at what he does. And he was like, hey, Mustafa, how do I invest? And at the time, I had maybe just a bachelor's degree. And that started to kind of uncover this gap in the market that over time I really picked at to say, like, fundamentally, how do you help people at scale? Maybe it isn't by becoming a doctor. Maybe it's by really helping people understand their money, helping people build financial freedom. And that's what I've done through real estate. I've helped over 291 investors. I've helped them make over 20.2 million. And what's important isn't just the money. It's what that money buys you, because ultimately that money is a tool and it enables you to really build a purposeful life. And that really can mean different things for different people, Faisal.
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to know. I mean, you had a traditional path already as a geneticist, as a doctor. You had told me before that you come from an entrepreneurial family, which I find very interesting because I wasn't originally. So for me, the transition was very difficult into entrepreneurship. So I'm wondering about that too. But I'd love to know, and for viewers' sake as well, what was the moment of sort of the struggle for you to decide to go towards this non-traditional path? Was there? Maybe there wasn't.
Sure, sure. I'm very happy to unpack that. So, Faisal, first I want to just kind of clarify a couple things. I studied genetics, but I didn't become a geneticist. That would have
Okay.
required, let's say, a master's degree. Instead, I went to medical school, and then I didn't complete medical school. Very early on, I was, when you talk about challenges, for me, it was about opportunity cost. Is this the most efficient way to help people? Was the thing that I was thinking about. And I think that answer is different for everybody. But when I was studying medicine, I didn't see myself being in my own office treating patients every day. I saw myself as building infrastructure, maybe owning the hospital, etc. But if you look in the US today, very few doctors own the hospital. It's usually businesses that own the hospital. So there's a disconnect. And I think, Faisal, the first challenge for me was really saying, hey, like I'm on this path and this path makes sense and everyone is doing this path, etc. But it doesn't make sense for me. So I think that that was the first challenge that I faced, Faisal. And it was really a moment where you just have to believe in yourself and say, hey, I want to do this, and I think that this is going to create the most value for people ultimately. And in that situation, it was, hey, I want to quit medicine. It wasn't, hey, I want to go work in big pharma, or I want to launch a real estate investment firm, or I want to make people millions of dollars. I didn't know what I wanted to do per se, but I just knew what I was doing right now wasn't the right path forward. And then you touched on like my business background or my family's business background, etc. I think for me, Faisal, as I worked in big pharma, day one, the numbers just didn't make sense. I was looking at it and I'm looking at myself, people around me, etc. And it feels like there's a gap in terms of how much they're making, how much they're saving, what they're doing to build wealth. And the writing's on the wall, but it feels like no one can really read. So to me, it was a huge disconnect. Like, hey, why don't people kind of understand these basic, personal finance things? And I think to some degree, Faisal, comes down to maybe my background. Maybe, when you're sitting on the dinner table, you're absorbing all this information and you don't really realize that. And you don't get a degree in business. You don't have like a business degree or an MBA or anything like that. But when you speak to people who maybe do have some of these degrees, it still feels like there's a knowledge gap. And I think, Faisal, for me, that's really been very powerful to say you aren't your degree. You don't need to be stuck in a certain lane. If you're doing something and you're not creating as much value as you'd like, there's always the opportunity to pivot and change and really focus on growing 1% every day, if that makes sense, Faisal. And then you'll look back a couple of years later and you'll have aggressively scaled. And it will be hard to point to maybe one decision, but it'll just be an accumulation of multiple small steps that you took along the way.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So for me, it was similar in some senses. I left the engineering career to go towards business, which I didn't even know what the business model was. I just knew that I wanted to work with people. I didn't want to be in tech, and I had realized at that point that, you know what, I made that decision because it seemed the most logical at the time because I was good in sciences, might as well go towards there. But I realized pretty fast I was much more interested in helping people than helping being on computer and working through that stuff. So that led me towards the coaching path and business path. And about a few years after, when I kind of started to get a grasp, let's say 3 years after, I realized I had told you that too in our last conversation, that I realized it just hit me that in all the years of education, work, and everything, the three most important things that I needed to know, it wasn't really taught. It was kind of inferred by everybody. One was knowing who I was, like with all the accumulation of thoughts, behaviors, emotions that come, the culture that we're a part of, who I was in the picture, and how do I know if I'm listening to my voice or versus everybody else's voice, for the good or the bad. Um, how do I make sense of finances and how do relationships work? Essentially, I've learned in the past few years, in the past decade plus, is those are the three things you need to be successful internally and externally. If you don't know that, then and so it's hard for a lot of people to make those decisions to move forward. But I want to celebrate you for making and you started thinking at a scale rather than helping one person at a time. Like, how can I scale this to the next level? And not everybody thinks like that, but that's pretty cool to hear.
Thank you, Faisal. And what I would say is, I think to some degree, we're not really taught to think like that. These aren't things that come up in school, whether you're in Canada, you're in the US, you're in Europe, wherever you might be, right? There's not really the idea that, hey, you need to slow down and you need to think about, personal happiness, what makes you happy, what drives you, your inner motivations. There's none of that. It's more like, hey, these are the core metrics. This is what you need to do, and this is how you become a good employee. I think subconsciously, that's really how we're trained in the education system. It's like, hey, question everything, but don't question our system. Learn everything, but don't learn about yourself. So to me, those are like huge gaps that, platforms like this really talk about to say like ultimately in a very basic level, what is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of your life? What do you want to actually accomplish in your life? And sometimes we just kind of skip those questions to just get into like more robotic rut type thinking of like, hey, I just need this metric. Let's say in that real estate example, hey, I need to raise this much capital to do these transactions to own 1,000 doors. Why do you want to own 1,000 doors? What if those doors are negatively cash flowing, right? So sometimes the metrics we spit out, like, hey, my AUM is this, but maybe I have too much debt, right? Like sometimes the metrics we use don't really efficiently and accurately describe what's going on, which is why like my metrics were more like the people that I'm helping and how much they've made. Because that's like not their net worth. It's not like hypothetical, they're up on paper. It's how much liquid cash that they actually make, not how many doors they own or anything like that. Because sometimes it's really about being hyper specific and hyper clear to say, hey, if you want to build freedom, what does that look like? Is it a number? Is it a lifestyle? And if that freedom enables you to do something, what does that look like and how do we optimize for that? So those are the types of conversations, Faisal, that I like to have ideally with clients.
Awesome. I love that. Before we go into what's going on in the market or the fear around it and what's happening in the business world, I'd love to know a little bit about you personally. I mean, outside of the business world, like what makes you you? What's your idea of freedom? How do you interact with your family? Like what are the values that drives you as a human being?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Muslim, so I'm really,
Mhm.
faith-based. My religion is very important to me. I'm married. I have two kids. I have a 6-year-old daughter and a 3-year-old daughter at the time of this recording. And for me, family is really important. I grew up in a big family. My dad was the eldest of 5 sons. So I really grew up around a lot of family, and I love that. And I think that really helps you grow and learn from a very maybe non-traditional perspective, right? Like the idea of family in the US today is very nuclear. The idea of, family for me is very extended, and I love that. When it comes to, what is the goal in life, I think fundamentally growing up, I always learned this idea that, we're here to help people. And I think that altruism was really one of the guiding principles that I saw in my life. And there's just so many, random anecdotal experiences, but it's really summarized by the idea that you can help people just by smiling, right? Like there's so many situations where maybe you're walking down New York City or Toronto or wherever you might be, and you see a homeless person or somebody who's struggling, and the idea is kind of like, hey, don't talk to me or I'm gonna ignore that you exist, versus like a smile and hey, how's your day going? Like, hey, I don't have any cash, but I hope you have a nice day. Maybe check out this shelter or whatever it is. There's so many ways to help without necessarily spending money. But sometimes we don't even slow down enough to acknowledge that person's existence, which for me is a bit unsettling, especially when we kind of, I guess, talk about, what's going on globally, because it really ties in the idea that we sometimes dehumanize people, the idea that sometimes we react emotionally to things and how that impacts us in the short term and the long term, because that behavior is then what I model to my children, right? If I'm not able to slow down and smile and talk nicely to a stranger who's struggling, then how can I say to my daughters, hey, be a good person? What does being a good person
Yeah.
mean? It means be nice to people you know and don't be nice to people you don't know, because that's the behavior that I'm modeling. Instead of be nice to everybody, which is what they're learning in kindergarten. So it's like all the good lessons that we should be implementing, we kind of learned in kindergarten and we just forgot. We kind of learned it from our scriptures, but we kind of forgot. And I think life is fundamentally a lot more simpler than we make it, if that makes sense, Faisal.
Oh, I love that. So I ran an experiment after I quit my career path, and I didn't work that long in the field. I worked a couple of years in the field, and before that, in high school and college, I heard, especially in high school, I would hear either adults around me or my teachers, and the narrative was summoned. Wait until you get to the real world. You'll see how crazy it is. This is like a huge fear around how the real world operates. Of course, it's more complex when you're building your own life and everything. I've realized that as I move forward. And I believe in experiments. I'm like, let me put this to test, and I do extreme things. So I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna quit and let's see what happens. And of course, for some people that might be risky. I started driving Uber, and I started building my business path. And then fast forward a few years later, I remember one of the younger people in my family. She was just graduating college to go to university. I looked at her just to test it out. I'm like, let me guess. You think the real world is really scary, and you're about to graduate and everything. He's like, yeah, how did you know? I'm like, well, because that's what I'd been hearing all my life, and you're probably hearing the same thing. But and I would say just working with adults who are at so many levels, like from, and I was surprised a lot of times people with PhDs, scientists working for NASA to, I was like, well, these people must be really super smart, and they are, in one area. And then for some reason they left their brain in that area and not used it in their personal life. A lot of times they would be shocked, just like, I'm like, you have a skill set in this area for organizing a whole organized, like a multi-million dollar organization, but they wouldn't bring the same skill set in the personal life. And it would hit them in a shocking way. It's as if they were taught to compartmentalize knowledge and understanding of the world. But the interesting thing that I've learned is that we all overcomplicate life. It's like life is, like you said, fairly straightforward. Like you get what you look for. Yes, there's complexity in it, but we also over complexify with our own mind. And I've really learned to like not only believe but really look at whatever we're building is an output of whatever you're thinking and feeling constantly every day. And for some reason, I don't know the mechanisms around how everything in the universe works, but everything else starts to cooperate with you when you start to go towards the things that matter to you. And it's not easy in the beginning because a lot of the resistance is internal. And so it's really cool. As you go through that process, it simplifies as you move forward. And that's essentially what I've learned. The more I work with people individually and at a group context, the simpler their life gets. Even if complexity comes, they're able to simplify it. But yeah, that's a really cool idea that you shared. So that I feel very aligned with that.
I love it, Faisal. And what I would add is, I don't know if you've ever heard this, saying, but it comes from skiing, where it's like you can either look at the path and follow the path, or you can look at the trees and like hit a tree. And I guess the similar equivalent would be when you're learning to drive. You can look at all the cars and kind of get that anxiety or feel afraid that you're going to get into an accident, or you can look at where the space is and you can kind of just keep driving. I think the
Yeah,
reality is that our mind, our mentality, our mindset is so powerful. But again, you don't learn that in school. There isn't this idea that, hey, if you have a positive outlook, things will work out. That doesn't mean you won't have obstacles. It means you'll be able to manage obstacles. And there was even a study done, right, where they did a test on kids to say, one day kids with blue eyes were smarter, and they started to believe that. And they started to perform better, and they started to maybe be less kind to kids with brown eyes. And then the next day it was the reverse, where the kids with brown eyes were told that they're smarter by their teacher. Their teacher is in an authority position. They believe what their teacher is saying. And so they start to manifest that mentality and they start to perform better on exams, etc. And this has been done in prisons as well, in, universities. So it's one of those things that our mind is really powerful and is capable of doing a lot. But if you talk to somebody who is maybe very logical and you tell them, oh, just visualize success, they'll laugh at you like, what's wrong with you? And if you look at somebody
yeah,
who's maybe more has a higher EQ, maybe more emotional, they'll say, yeah, I 100% agree. But sometimes, Faisal, it's to say that, and you mentioned it with the NASA example, to say, hey, you have a core competency, you're very good in one area of life, how do you transfer that to be very good in multiple areas? You're very good at building a team. How do you build a team to manage your personal life? Because maybe your personal life
yeah,
is a mess. But there isn't that, I think for a lot of people, there isn't that clarity to say, hey, my personal life is a mess. Meanwhile, I can run this multi-billion dollar business. Let me just get a therapist. Let me just get a CPA. Let me just get a cleaner in my house. Let me just get build a team in my personal life to make life more efficient. And I think it comes down to like blind spots. We all have them, Faisal. I mean, I definitely do. And sometimes it's about having the right people around you who can call you out when you're wrong or who can point out your blind spots in a way that resonates with you. And everyone's communication style is different. And then that enables you to continue to grow if that's the goal in life.
Yeah, one of the biggest things I've learned, especially in business, because you're constantly testing things and you don't know, even if you keep testing something, you could be testing the wrong thing. And one of the best ways that I've learned to grow is have mentors, coaches, community of other people who are doing similar things. Everybody's kind of watching and giving you feedback. If you're not in an ecosystem like that, especially in business, you're toast because if you're listening to news or expert opinion on what's going on in the business world and everything, you don't have a pulse on the marketplace and you don't have multiple people testing it out around you. It is very hard to do business because then just like human mind, like you said, is very powerful. You'll grab onto some authority opinion, you'll tank your business instead of actually looking at what's actually happening in the day-to-day week because business is also always shifting. It's not just the bigger themes. And so I've learned to and one of the biggest things I've learned to see is that I have a lot of blind spots, and we all do, and that's part of the reason why I grew because somebody was able to see my blind spots and say, you know what, maybe you're not paying attention to these areas. Not in a way you should do this or you should do that, but in a way to get me to realize that, hey, maybe there's a different path forward, maybe there's a different way of looking at things. We'll circle back to some of these things, but let's jump into what's going on in the world, in the business world, investing world. Clearly, the economy has shifted, and there are other bigger scale things like war is happening. It's interesting. You look at the gas prices; they're like pretty much every week they're going up, and people know that it's connected to what's happening, and that just that will tell people how to react. And then on top of that, people are listening to news constantly. On top of that, they have other people around them giving them all kinds of information. And then now they're deciding, as like as Warren Buffett said, when people what was it? When people get greedy, get fearful. When people get fearful, get greedy. Right now, people are fearful. So, how do you look at that from a business point of view? How do you navigate your own business at this time?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, and there's so many different ways to answer it. I think let's focus on your question about business. I think fundamentally, when you run a business, you want to understand what's working well in the business and how to improve that. And you also want to understand what you want to test out. I think you mentioned as well that you like to tinker with things. You'd like to say, hey, things are going well. I have this stable job as an engineer. What happens if I quit? Let me experience that. In the startup space, which I'm not, I'm in real estate, but in the startup space, there's the idea of S curves where you always want to be testing out something new. That way, you always experience exponential growth, just like an S. So now that idea is like if you have a business that's doing well, maybe you're in that exponential growth phase. So you want to keep doing what you're doing. Maybe you're in that phase that you're plateauing. So you want to be testing out different things so that you're always growing. Now, that's, for your personal business. For the wider, what's going on economically, I'm in real estate. Nothing I do is impacting oil prices. Nothing I do is impacting gas. I don't even track gas. I drive an electric vehicle. I only know gas is going up when I'm, driving the family and I'm using that gas car, or my wife is texting me, gas is so expensive. And I'm just like, I'm
Mhm.
working right now. Why are you texting me? Right? Like, so I'm very focused on my thing, which is how people approach life. Right. And I got a laugh out of you, Faisal. So it resonates, right? A lot of people, especially guys, like we hone in on one thing and we're just focused on that one thing. And that can be problematic when there's so many external factors just spreading fear, right? The newspaper sells news. They sell news through fear because they've been conditioned and they've seen the positive ROI on selling fear. What that means is they're less likely to give you information, or they're more likely to give you that information in the context of fear because that's going to cause you to buy more newspapers. And I'm saying newspaper, the same is true for like media, right? Like your CNN, your BBC, whatever you listen to, there's always the context of there's something to be afraid of. And I think that that's very powerful if you're in like the entrepreneurial space or just in life, because to some degree you want to get the information, but maybe not get the emotion associated with the information. That way you can then analyze that information for yourself. If Trump comes out saying, "Hey, we're having great conversations with Iran," which happened, recently,
Yeah.
that's, one perspective. So you say, okay, that's one perspective. Then Iran comes out saying, "Hey, we're not talking to him at all until our war goals are met." That's another perspective. I don't even know what their war goals are. So if I'm in the US, specializing in real estate, to some degree I care about geopolitics because I don't necessarily want people to die, but also nothing I do in my business impacts that directly. So I can't get too bogged down in those details as much as I want to emotionally. So it's to say that if my core business relies on gas prices being high or low, then I need to be in the supply chain to actually impact that. If I'm
Yeah.
downstream and I am not able to impact that, then I kind of need to say, hey, that's an issue outside of what I can control. I now need to look at my underwriting and my assumptions and assume expenses are going to be higher. Because if gas is higher, transportation is going to cost more, then it's going to cost me more to get my lumber or whatever I'm buying, right? So I think Faisal, to some degree, it's a bit healthy to be a bit disconnected in the sense that in my business, there's nothing I can do to change geopolitics. But from a personal level, it's like, hey, what can I do? Maybe I need to support local politicians that are not going to go to war, right? If the agenda is saying no to war and that agenda changes, maybe I need to make sure my voice is heard, especially in America where we have, the idea of free speech, we have the idea of being politically involved, but sometimes we don't even know where that starts. And obviously this podcast, like a lot of what I do is not like politics or anything like that, but it's just to say that we live in the world, so we just want to be conscious of like what's going on in our surroundings while also focusing on an area of core competence, which for me is real estate and making money for people passively. But it's to say, how does that impact other lives? Tomorrow, if I'm living in New Jersey, I should be aware of like the local politicians, what they're doing and how they're improving the quality of life for people, because that's ultimately what I care about, improving the quality of life for people. So I guess in a very simple way, Faisal, what I would say is for anyone running a business, focus on your business, but maybe bury your head in the sand the right amount, if that makes sense. Like you need to be aware of what's going on in the world, in your backyard, etc. You need to be there for people, for your family, all of those different things. But fundamentally, you can't let whatever's going on in the world negatively impact your business. You want to build a resilient business that can handle both the booms and the busts of the market.
Yeah, for sure. And also, not to mention that there's opportunity around these times because pretty much the masses go nuts. There was this joke right after COVID. So in Canada, we were completely locked down for 2.5 years. In US, it was dependent where you stayed, but all of Canada was shut down. So right after COVID, the Ukraine war started, and there was a meme going around. People stopped talking about COVID. It's like Putin cured COVID. And then after that, it was the next thing. And after that, every cycle there's something. And I love what you said. Where is your sp sphere of control here? Yes, be aware of the world, but don't be inundated by it. And one of the things that people ignore, I think most people assume that they're very logical. I used to as well. Even if we are logical, what defines us as human beings is we are emotional. We react. Every thought, everything at a subconscious or conscious level affects us. And I always ask my clients, so if you ever had an argument with your wife or somebody close to you and you're about to start your work right after and it affects you, tell me how focused you are on your work. What's going on? And you'd be struggling to focus. Because you're a human being. There's nothing wrong about that. And the news, marketers, everyone is seeking your attention. Your attention primarily is emotional in nature. What if you look at every commercial from Coke to McDonald's to any kind of thing, they will not talk about that. They will talk about the emotional values behind it. Oh, you're having it was a Seinfeld joke. Is like he was it was one of his stand-up jokes. Is like sometimes I'm drinking this. I think he was talking about beer or Coke, one of these things. It's like I'm watching this commercial. People are jumping up and down. They're having fun, and I'm holding this can of Coke. And I'm like, am I doing something wrong in here? But they're associating the can of Coke with all the joy and everything else that comes with the human experience. That's an emotional. They know it works. News does the same thing. Be informed, but remember that you're kind of spending your attention. It's renewable in some senses, but it's also it expend you're spending that every day, every week, and when your attention goes to especially things that you don't have control over, things that are at a higher level. And I love what you said is like focus on your business. How do you do that? Sometimes you have to put blindfold and just focus on what matters. And I also want to add one part it might also be the way people look at the world. There's this question I loved from Einstein that said that maybe one of the most important questions is the universe a friendly place or not? And at least in his view, he said his conclusion was it is. But there are lots of people that are constantly, yes, protect yourself and your family, everything. There are dangers in the world, but they inherently believe that there's something negative about the world around them, that people are out there to get them, whether it be bigger powers or somebody else. I'm like, even if that's true, and I said this to somebody around me who was talking like that. I'm like, the fact that we're sitting here talking about this and there's not an authoritarian regime stopping us from doing that, and you're able to spend time with your family, love, you're able to be happy, you're able to earn your money, like you're not under a complete totalitarian rule. It should tell you that even if things are outside of your control, there are other forces in play that are also positive. And essentially, you can think about that and say, you know what? And if you're a man of faith or you're a person of faith, you also think that there's something higher power that's really positive. But people don't operate that way. They think that they're constantly being attacked by something. And I think that has a direct effect on your psychology when you think like that, even if you think you're not aware of that thinking, because now your mind is constantly seeking danger and that expends energy. Versus what you said, you have more of a positive mindset. It's like, hey, I'm gonna make this work. There are other people doing their part. I'll do my part. And I also look at it from an influence point of view. I would, if I feel like I'm doing everything that I can to support everybody around me, then the rest is not up to me. It's a higher power people, and then ultimately it's up to God, and that takes care of things. I think that alleviates a lot of pressure of everything in the world that people kind of take on without even being able to control that stuff.
I agree, Faisal. And what I would posit for the listeners, what if you're not actually that important, right? Like, what if you're very important for those people you interact with, but in the grand
Yeah.
scheme of things, in the thousands of years that the Earth has been around, and maybe the thousands of years the Earth will be around, what if in the grand scheme of things, in the grand scheme of creation, life, etc., you're not that important? Like, if you approach life from a religious perspective, right? God created life, and God has created a lot of lives, and we're just very, small in comparison to like how amazing God is. From like a genetics perspective, there's the idea that scientifically the probability of us being created, from apes or from like an amoeba or from like a single-celled organism is so low probability that it's so unlikely that it probably didn't happen. But we're around, so it happened. Whether it happened through like natural selection and evolution, okay, or whether it happened through God, okay. Whatever it is, fundamentally, you're alive, I'm alive, we're alive, and we do matter, and we believe that we matter. So if we believe that we matter on an individual level, how do we go about life doing the best we can versus maybe having that, more negative mentality that you posited? Because I think that that negative mentality is pervasive, but so is that positive mentality. There's a reason why the newspaper sells through fear. There's a reason why people are more likely to leave negative criticism versus positive criticism. And the reason is probably or potentially because positive feedback is a given, is an expectation. People are naturally like positive. It takes a lot for people to be negative, and that's what stands out. Just like if you had a white piece of paper and there's a black dot on it, you'd say, hey, why is this black dot here? You won't see all the
Yeah.
white, all the good. You'll see the one black dot. Um, and that's not to say white is good and black is bad. It's just to give an analogy to say maybe there's a lot more good in the world than we realize, but because we don't value it, because we take it for granted, we never really pause to just say, hey, it's an amazing day. That amazing day could be sunny, or it could be
Yeah.
gloomy and rainy. And that rain can be what, gives plants the water they need to grow, to feed us, right? Fundamentally, it's just a matter of perspective.
Yeah. So many people that come to me, they're very high achieving business owners. They're on this go, go, go train, especially if they're on the younger end. They're like in their 30s. And I had one client recently told me, he's like, one day I just want to just smile for the sake of smiling. I'm like, that let that be our goal, because that's a better goal than you making a bunch of money, to be honest. Like I look forward to speaking to you in a couple of months where you're just smiling just for the heck of it. And another client, I got on a call with him. This was years ago. This was 6 years ago, and for some reason he either believed that or thought that just the way I was operating. He's like, you know what? I feel like you can. I just need like 15 minutes of peace within. 15 minutes of peace within. I don't have it. You wouldn't be able to tell if you looked at that person. Ultra successful, every aspect of his life is great. He looks great. On the outside, smiles, but internally, he was not at peace. And fast forward about 6 months later, I did ask him that question. I'm like, so do you feel like you have that 15 minutes? He's like, oh no, I have hours of it. I'm like, what changed? Like his perspective completely changed, like you said. What we and I take it back to our mind is incredibly powerful, human mind, but it's the brain is set up, at least a part of it is set up to protect you constantly and those around you. And it's much easier to, like I said, to notice threats than it is the positive. This is why pretty much every culture and religion has within it some kind of gratitude practice, some kind of. My wife started this thing with kids where before we get started eating, we were just saying thanks to anything. And now my 6-year-old daughter, she stops us. It's like, stop eating. Like let's talk about what we're thankful for, grateful for. But when you think about it, there's a lot when you really think about it. And it's the same thing shows up when I work with couples that it's much simpler to criticize a behavior. It's much harder to look for the positive. But once you look for it, you realize there's a lot more positive than there is negative. Uh, but it's not very ready-made because you have to train your mind to do that. Because the primary function is to protect you. The secondary function is also to create a better life. And that's where the conscious path comes in. And that's where maybe we can talk a little bit about the long-term path. Because ultimately, none of the wealth, none of the resources that you build, or the time freedom that you build, whatever idea of freedom is, or family you build, is gonna matter if you feel like it does not matter for you. If internally you feel like a void, there's a void there, or internally you feel disconnected, or you feel disconnected from your environment, or your tendencies just jump from one opportunity to the next one, thinking that that'll make you happy. But what is your idea of long term? If we look at it from a purpose point of view, do you feel like there's a purpose that you have as an individual here on Earth? And do you feel like we do have a purpose as a species? How do you make sense of that? How do you reconcile that long term?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Faisal. I think fundamentally the answer is rooted maybe in my religious values, maybe in my familial values, to just say that I would want to leave the world a little bit better off than when I came into it, right? Like we have the idea, like in the Islamic tradition, Islamic faith, like if you're going to the bathroom to do wudu, like you clean up after yourself, and the bathroom should look cleaner when you exit.
Mhm.
But then maybe if you went to the mosque, if you went to the church, if you went to the religious institution, that bathroom is very messy. And it's like there's a disconnect between like what we learn in kindergarten or what we learn like at a very basic level at home and what we experience in the world. So for me, it's like how do you take that idea and actually implement it? Is it by just being nice to people? What does that look like? Is it by creating revenue streams for people? What does that look like? Is that by upskilling people? What does that look like? And then ultimately, Faisal, just like that medical school example, what is the most efficient way to do this? And it's not to treat, my life like robotic or anything. It's to say that, hey, if I'm spending a dollar, if I'm investing a dollar, how do I get the maximum ROI? How do I define ROI? How do I understand that it's not just numbers based, it's also qualitative? Like if you're changing one person's life, that has a knockdown effect of changing their whole family, which is very powerful for me. So I think to some degree that's what I look at, Faisal. The thing that's important for me is really positioning myself every day to the best of my ability that I can add genuine value for people. It might be a monologue where I'm talking to people about financial literacy when they just wanted to talk about investing, but maybe they have a tax problem. Maybe they're in a high income bracket and they need a tax strategist, right? Like right now it's tax season, so they're probably talking to their CPA and they don't realize that their CPA's job is to file taxes, not to build tax strategy. Those are two completely different jobs, right? People don't know that. And that's a knowledge gap. I might spend maybe half an hour talking about that instead of talking about the real estate investments that they wanted to talk about because I'm seeing that there's a grave problem or concern that I have. And so for me, Faisal, like that's maybe one way it manifests. The other way is like maybe it's Eid or it's like a religious holiday and you run into people who don't have food to put on their table. And in that interaction, they're asking for more and more money. And that more and more money feels a bit absurd. Like it feels like a $5 donation went to like $300. But in the grand scheme of things, if God has positioned me in a way where $300 really doesn't matter, then it's fine. Like it's not a big deal. And it's just an interesting experiment, just like you mentioned, that interesting experiment about like quitting your job. It's to say like, hey, fundamentally, if it's not my money, if it's God's money, then what is my responsibility to that money? It should just be a good shepherd to the best of my ability and just to try to help people in whatever capacity I can. So I think, Faisal, that's really how I would approach life, just to say, like, step back, I'm not really that important. It's not really that my money. It's just on loan to me, and I'm responsible for kind of distributing it in the way that makes sense to me to the best of my ability.
Yeah, I love that. I'm curious. I have a couple of questions that might sound a little bit odd, but if you were to, if you're able to go back in time and meet your younger self 20 years in the past, what would you tell him for him to create a better path forward?
I think I would tell him the things that we're talking about, to be honest with you, Faisal. To say, like, fundamentally, you don't learn in school to learn about yourself, understand yourself. So just spend more time reflecting, more time than already as a kid. I spent a lot of time reflecting. I was blessed to be around a lot of people, etc. A lot of decision making that maybe didn't resonate with me, whether it's my friends or my family friends or whatever, where it's like, hey, why is this person, in high school getting high? That makes no sense. Why is this person drinking? That makes no sense. Why is this person have a girlfriend? That makes no sense to me personally. And what does that manifest later in life? Maybe, he's a kid at a young age where he's not in a position to take care and provide for his family. Maybe he overdoses and passes away. Like, I'm not saying like I grew up in a very nice area, etc. But there are definitely people who passed away before 30 because of drug overdoses. There are definitely people who had children, before 20 that might have been challenging for them to manage. I don't know. I didn't experience, like I didn't live that life. But it's to say that like you can learn from your decisions, but you can also learn from other people's decisions. And I think as a young kid, I was already doing that, reflecting on these types of things. But I think in all of that reflection, in all of that, how am I going to grow type thing or what am I going to do? I'm good at science, like you mentioned. I'll just become a doctor. I don't think there was a plurality of a conversation to say, like, you can do whatever you want, and here's what that means. There was the conversation, Mustafa, like, the world is your oyster, you can do whatever you want. That was firmly established, which I think the fact that that was firmly established at such a young age enabled me to be in a position where I could get married young, I could have kids young, I could build a life, from a young age with like solid foundation. I could quit medical school if I wanted to with some degree of like inner conviction. But I think fundamentally, to really succinctly answer your question, Faisal, I think I would tell my younger self to believe in yourself more aggressively, to make maybe more radical decisions, to do whatever you want to do, but then really reflect on the value of what you did, right? Like if you're a kid who's like playing FIFA, what value is playing FIFA for you long term? If it's no value, cut it out. Or if it does have some intrinsic value that you should be able to like enjoy your life and maybe FIFA brings you enjoyment, zero in on that. And I just mentioned that as like an example because kids play video games, right? As an adult, if it's working in a big company like I worked at Pfizer, I worked at Janssen, I worked at, J&J, I worked at like established companies. But when I was working at those companies, I knew that that wasn't the end goal. And I knew that because I had kind of written out what I wanted to do. If I wanted to own that hospital in that example, working at Pfizer was not going to get me to that position, in my humble opinion. I needed to make more revenue, make more money to be able to build a hospital, etc. So I think Faisal, for me, it's just to some degree as an adult talking to myself, it's like, hey, believe in yourself. Hey, work on your weaknesses. Like you're dyslexic, work on that ahead of time, understand what that means. And that's what I did, like working at Pfizer, working in drug development. There's a reason why I took those types of jobs. It was really to like iron out my weaknesses, which was like reading comprehension. I studied genetics, which is like very dense. So it's like you have challenges, but like learn how to overcome them so that they don't become obstacles later. Because what happens, Faisal, for like high performing people, which I was not growing up. Growing up, I was not a high performing person. Did well, but I wasn't like, top 0.1% or 1% of the class. But the challenge that I see, and I'm surrounded by a lot of high performing people, they don't experience failure at a young age. So they don't learn the skill set of overcoming failure and overcoming obstacles. I always experienced setbacks, right? Like I would read my B's as D's. If this was Arabic, I would read my noon as a ba, right? Like these are fundamental issues that are like challenging. So you learn to like read the same sentence like 10 times and you learn to self-correct and you learn to identify things that just look off. So you pay more focus and more attention on that. Those skills helped me, subconsciously I developed those skills at a young age and they helped me throughout life where I would get that feedback, Mustafa is a hard worker. And I would look at it like that feedback feels alien. It doesn't feel like it resonates. It doesn't feel like it makes sense. But now today, when I work through a 10-hour day or whatever, and I look outside and it's nighttime and I'm like, where did the day go? I can understand that mentality. Oh, Mustafa's a hard worker because you look around and other people are like, hey, it's 9:30. I still have another 7.5 hours left in my workday. That's a very different mentality, right? So it's to say that fundamentally, I think for people, for myself, early on, I got the feedback to optimize, to learn and grow, and then leverage that later for salary. That was very pivotal feedback that I got from an older cousin of mine, a mentor of mine, that I tell people all the time. But more than that, it's to say that as a kid, you're going to have strengths and weaknesses. You're going to make money from your strengths, but your weaknesses are what's going to stop you from being successful. So you want to live a very balanced life where you want to minimize your weaknesses and maximize your strengths, and then fundamentally be able to zoom out and say like, hey, I just want to be a good person. Life isn't that deep. It doesn't matter if I make $1 million. Why is my goal even a million? It's an arbitrary number that's not, doesn't really reflect the impact of inflation, right? Do I want to make a million this year in my lifetime, etc., by retirement? Like the goal shouldn't of success shouldn't be monetary. It should just be like your manners at a very basic level. And then the value you create. If you focus on creating as much value as possible, then you can position yourself where you're able to monetize. You can look at Facebook today, Meta today. It's a very valuable company. When it IPO'd, people were like, how is this company going to make money? They didn't focus on monetizing day one. They focused on value creation. Same could be said of Tesla. Same could be said of many different startups that end up being very successful. It's to focus on creating a lot of value and then pivot and monetize. What I do in ground up construction, it's all about focusing on value creation. And then you have a product that's nice to live in that you're able to monetize off of. So I think Faisal, from my perspective, as if I was talking to myself as a young kid, it would be to really understand where I'm at that age, 10, 15, etc. Speak to me at a 10, 15-year-old kind of level to say, hey, these are the things that you're not learning in school that you should kind of just be aware of and reflect on. And it all starts with like having that inner clarity of like knowing yourself, while it's also knowing, hey, you're gonna change every couple of years, you're gonna change, you're gonna have different goals, aspirations, desires, and that's okay.
Yeah, I love that. A couple of other questions to wrap up because this will be important, and I also want the viewers to think about these because they're important. I love what you said that if you don't like if you are not reflecting and you're just putting some random arbitrary numbers and you don't know what that means to you personally. I mean, one of the biggest things that I've seen with entrepreneurs when they hit a goal 5 years, 10 years later, and they worked hard and it's challenging, and they get there, and their biggest thing usually is go to the next one. But then if they get a moment of reflection, it's like they'll be like, I don't know why I did that. They don't really know that. They just know that they were pushed, they were influenced, they had this opportunity, but they don't know why they did that. And I feel like that's such a personal question that you need to be able to answer that because a lot of our meaning and purpose comes from that. And so it's an important question for everybody to answer. How would they, how would they talk to their younger self? How would they tell them? Because that also means that you're probably going to talk to your kids in a similar fashion as well. I'd love to hear this. So let's say you were long gone. It's I don't know, it's 20 plus years after you're gone, your grandkids or kids are on the table, or great grandkids are on the table. And how would you want them to remember you or your values? It doesn't have to be you, but like, what would you want them to remember you by?
I think Faisal is a great question. It's like a question that's actually a bit emotional in the sense that like you're no longer around to be there for your loved ones. I think fundamentally at a basic level, I would want my kids, my grandkids to say like, Papa, whatever my, grandkids call me. He loved me. So at a very basic level, he loved me. At a deeper level, when I needed him, he was there for me. And at a deeper level, he gave me the tools to succeed. Right? And in that order, like number one, at the very basic level, he loved me. Number two, he was there for me when I needed him. Right? Because my goal is not to be omnipresent in my children's life. I'm not planning on dropping them off to school. I'm not planning to teach them whatever they're learning in elementary school, etc. I'm not planning to be there for every little thing or every big thing because you don't know what's going to be little or big in your kid's life. But fundamentally, I want it to be like when I think of charity, I think of my dad. That's really powerful, right? Because that's not the situation for everybody, right? So I can look at it and say, hey, when I think of like mindset, I also think of my dad. I think like his mentality is I can do anything. Now, how that manifests is kind of on him, but how it's molded me is on me. And so for my kids, I would want something similar. At a deeper level, I would want to say like, hey, like I learned all of my spirituality, religiosity from my dad. I would be honored if that was the situation. I need to do a lot more work to be at that point where I can say, hey, like I embody that. But I think, for me, when I look at my kids, my grandkids, I would want them to think, hey, when I needed someone to turn to and I couldn't turn to anybody, I did not turn to ChatGPT as my private therapist and tell them my deep, dark secrets. I turned to my grandfather, my father, and he was there for me. He dropped everything and he was there for me while also always clarifying what he does is important. Because I think for me, when you're on this journey of financial freedom, there gets to a point where you're like, what's the point? Like, I don't need to work, I don't need to make more money, etc. But I think if you have that mentality in one place, and you also have the mentality that wealth doesn't last 3 generations, it doesn't last 3 generations partly because people don't see like the hard work that goes into creating that wealth. And you want to have kids who have good discipline, so you have to embody that and you have to kind of train that as a skill. So for me, I tell my kids like I work for them. I tell them that and I reiterate that and I have them tell me that as well because it's very important to have good work ethic in my opinion because like from our faith, God swears by time, right? Time is like the idea of maximizing your time is very important to me, but it's on the individual to say like what is an efficient use of their time. You could be staying at home and raising amazing kids. That could be more efficient than going and making $1 million. And I think it is personally, right? You could go and slow down enough to talk to the person on the street and be nice to them. I think that that's really important versus maybe closing another transaction, right? It's all dependent on the individual. For me, circling back to your question, with my kids, with my grandkids, I would want it to be very faith-based, but very at their level, where whenever I needed something, my grandfather was there and I miss him, maybe I'll pray for him. And that's amazing. Maybe I'll adopt that in my life. How can I be there for people to the best of my ability? Because you're not going to be there all the time. You're not always going to be there for everybody. So what you want to do is to some degree, you want to be there as much as you can for as many people as you can, and ultimately give your kids and your grandkids the tools to succeed. And to me, a lot of those tools are like mindset and soft skills that growing up as a kid, I wouldn't value it, right? You wouldn't necessarily say, oh, hey, my friend is resilient. He got bullied and it didn't, negatively impact him. You just look at like, why is he getting bullied? Why are people not protecting him type thing. But as you get older, I think you see different people who are very successful and you can trace it down to their habits, their routines, and you can say, why do they have these habits? Why do they have these routines? It's because of their mentality. So I think, and this is a gap that I don't think school really teaches to build strong people, is to really empower them emotionally and intelligently in terms of how they manage obstacles. Because in that example that I mentioned, high performers, there's many studies out there that tell you high performers suck when it comes to failure, I've been around high performers who are like driving a manual car, stalling 10 times on like going up a hill, and I'm sitting there like, not laughing, but laughing type situation where, hey, like, don't worry, I can take care of this for you, and this is how you learn the skill. For me, with my kids, it's like I always want them to be in positions where they're failing so that they learn that failing is okay. It's part of the journey. It's not a destination. Just because you failed when you're trying to balance the clutch one time does not mean you don't know how to drive. It just means that, hey, this was challenging. We'll learn this skill later. And I think those are the types of things that I would want my kids and my grandkids to really embody or think of me when life is coming at them, because to some degree life is always coming at you. It's just how you perceive it. You either perceive it as an opportunity or an obstacle.
Yeah, for sure. I love that. So, I mean, I can have these conversations for hours long. I know you probably have a lot of important things to do, and I need to prepare for a meeting too. But it was a pleasure talking to you, and thank you for sharing your deepest thoughts with me. And I, I really, as much as I want to talk about the technical aspects of business, but ultimately, these are the questions that people end up with. Business becomes the medium, cash flow becomes the medium. But what are you doing with that? What is the purpose behind it? That is a real question for people. How does that impact the people around you? How are you going to carry forward? How are you going to live day to day? Are you going to, like you said, wait for your job to finish, or you're not even going to notice how the day went? You had so much fun. I joke around with my kids. I'm like, when they're waiting for something, it's like, listen, if you have fun, you're not gonna be waiting for anything. If you're waiting here staring at me, you're gonna be waiting for a long time because time is relative. But I want to thank you for sharing all those. I'd love for you to share how can people connect with you and reach out to you, and so they can. And I'll put all that information below this on all our channels as well.
Yeah, Faisal, I think the best way is LinkedIn. I post there every day, Monday through Friday. The goal is really to focus a lot on this mindset stuff, right? We can talk about, real estate, we can talk about cash flow, we can talk about opportunity zones, value add, etc. And all of that is great. But I think the biggest gap that I see for high performing people is these mindset, shifts to say, hey, you're very good here. How do we translate that to reflect in all aspects of your life to improve your quality of life? Because I think, financial freedom really comes down to quality of life. How can I create a life that I don't have to be stressed out about money or about what the future looks like or about how to create generational wealth for my grandkids?
Awesome, awesome. Thank you for being here. And please, whoever is listening to this, share this with anybody. It was a powerful conversation. I know anybody who's creating a path that matters, and they need to listen to some of the thoughts that Mustafa has shared. Thank you so much for being here, Mustafa.
Thank you. Have a good one.